Hello, and welcome to our webinar today. It's good to have all of you with us. Before we jump into this, we are talking about religion in America, trends in the past, options for the future. I'm very fortunate today to have gotten Daniel Cox and Ross Douthat to come and join this conversation on this, what I think is a very important topic. Daniel Cox is a research fellow in polling and public opinion at the American Enterprise Institute, where I'm also housed. Ross Douthat, of course, is a New York Times columnist and also author of the recently published, no longer forthcoming as his official bio says, book, The Decadent Society, which should make a nice dovetail into our topic today, I think. Today we'll start. I'll give a very brief presentation talking a little bit about what the report showed, and also a few other things that, given that the report was already extraordinarily long, didn't make the cut, but may be interesting for our conversation today. And I'm going to attempt to keep my opening remarks brief because I think the most interesting part of this conversation will be the conversation. We do have mechanics for anyone watching to ask questions. If you send us a question, it'll get processed through and we will be able to respond to it after we've had a bit of the referee discussion at the beginning of this. So without any more delay, I just want to jump right into our topic today. I'm going to share my screen. So the report's title was Promise and Peril, but my presentation I'm calling Ashes and Dust, the Future of Religion in America. The future of religion in America? Perhaps. So I've also chosen a nice and depressing picture as the backdrop for my presentation because this is, I think, the perspective that we see on religion in America from many angles, that it's rapidly heading into terminal decline, that it is headed towards a kind of death. And certainly there's plenty of the report that I've written that can feed into that narrative. But by the time I get to the end, I actually want to challenge this view that religiosity in America is necessarily going to follow this sort of terminal downward slope. So to start with just a little bit of history, this graph is really the central project of the report that I published with AEI. And it's looking at 3 different measures of religiosity over almost 400 years of American history, put together from many sources. So the blue line is simply the share of people who would probably say that they were some kind of religion if you asked them. In recent periods, we actually have surveys of this. In previous periods, there's a bit of guesswork involved. The red line is the share of the adult population that's actually a member of some church body. So this is measuring the groups of people that religious organizations see as their communities. And then the gray line is the likely share of adults that actually showed up to church on an average week in that year. So what we can see is that these trends, they don't all have the same trend, but they do have related trends. The late 18th and early 19th centuries, so that's sort of this period, were definitely a low ebb for religiosity in America across all measures. And then religiosity rose until the middle of the 20th century. And since then, it has declined rather precipitously, as we can see over on this far end. Now, America today, by some measures, is still more religious than it was for much of its history. In terms of membership in a religious body, we're still much more religious than we were for much of the 18th and 19th centuries. In terms of regularity of religious attendance, Americans today are still more religious than they were at some points in the past. Of course, in terms of affiliation, Americans are considerably less religious than at any point in our past. Which of these is the most important metric, of course, can be debated. But from my perspective, I see them all as valid indicators. They're just measuring sort of different experiences of religiosity. But today, clearly, all of them are declining, representing a pretty unprecedented period of religious decline. But that decline, I want to emphasize, is not quite what it might appear. Those graphs might make you think that all adults are experiencing the same trend. But what we actually see is that most change in religiosity is driven by differences between age cohorts. It's not driven by differences within an age cohort. So this shows groups of people by what decade they were born. So each line is a different decade of birth. And it shows the frequency of their annual religious attendance on average for that cohort in each year of their life. So this x-axis is their year of age. What we can see is that in pretty much every generation, peak religiosity occurs around age 12. And then it declines sharply until they are somewhere between 18 and 22. And then it tends to rise gradually. Now, more recent generations have had less of an increase. They've had less of a return to religion, but there's still no evidence of continuing adult secularization. Rather, people are at their least religious between the ages of 18 and 22, and they, on average, they either stay the same or get slightly more religious over the rest of their life. That is to say, declining religion is not about adults making a decision to leave religion. It's not about the deeply considered rational choices of people who've decided to leave the church. The vast majority of decline in religiosity in America is happening to 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds, 16-year-olds. It's happening to minors while they're at home. So there's no evidence of net departure from religion after age 22. Of course, some people do depart, but this is not the period when people primarily leave religion. And we see across all generations that religiosity plummets during the secondary school years. But there are differences across cohorts. So you can see the older cohorts, these blue lines, were much more religious as children than the younger cohorts. There's been a lot of change in religiosity simply across cohorts. And this is the primary driver of long-run changes in religiosity. It's not just me who says this. There's a wide range of scholarship on long-run changes in religiosity across countries, suggesting that changes across cohorts rather than within them are the main driver of religious change. This isn't about lots of adults being persuaded to change their mind on questions of eternal truth. That's not what's driving secularization in America. Which means it's not about adults making rational choices for themselves. It's not about appealing to young people or social values. These are not the main drivers of secularization. It's about family. It's about things happening to 15-year-olds. So what family activities seem to matter for religiosity? One is simply the frequency of within household, that is non-church religious activities. So here I've put together 3 surveys, 2 of them longitudinal, 1 of them cross-sectional, looking at the frequency of religious activities, particularly conducted with families. National Longitudinal Survey of Youth has the best questionnaire on this. They specifically ask about at-home religious activities. And then we have 3 different metrics. The probability that a child raised in a Christian household remains Christian. I focused on Christians just because they're the largest sample size. The odds that a Protestant or Catholic remains Protestant or Catholic, and the odds, the blue line is the odds that they remain in the exact same denomination at age 30. And what we can see, and then the x-axis is the frequency of family religious activities. And what we can see is, while the effect size is not always enormous, households that have more family religious activities have children who are more likely to remain religious later in life. And I should say that this is not the raw value. This is actually the central estimate with controls for parental religiosity, household and child education, and race and I believe income as well. So This is saying controlling for how religious the parent is. That is, they say religion is very important to them or not so important. The actual frequency of religious activity at home is quite an important predictor of whether a child grows up and remains religious. And I should note that these top estimates here for the probability of remaining Christian are statistically indistinguishable from 100%. That is, we can't conclusively really say that there's like any attrition in households among children who grow up in households with daily household religious practice. So those household activities matter, but secondary school education in a religiously supportive environment also matters. So this is not my own research. I have 3 papers that are very interesting. This one looks at a reform in Turkey which restricted access to religious secondary schools. And in this case, I'm looking specifically at the religious behavior of women wearing head coverings. And what we can see is that cohorts exposed to restricted religious education options exhibit much lower religious behaviors, in this case, wearing a head covering. A brand new study that came out this month, so unfortunately I don't cite it in the report, looked at the opposite issue, a case of expansion of religious secondary education. In this case, Indonesia accidentally increased their subsidies for religious secondary school. In fact, they intended to do the opposite, but they mixed up their policy and they accidentally subsidized religious secondary schools. But they didn't do it in all areas. It was essentially random which schools got subsidies. Kids who grew up in areas that had randomly subsidized religious education, when they grew up, they read the Quran more frequently, and they more frequently participated in organized prayer. That is, they had stronger religious identity. They were also more likely to speak Arabic and less likely to use Indonesian. Finally, we can look at a context of Christianity, looking at France in the late 19th century. And what we can see, there were 2 laws that basically made it more expensive to attend Catholic schools. And what we can see is that this did decrease attachment to Catholic institutions. Right? So we can see across countries, across contexts, that we don't have a lot of studies because there just hasn't been a lot of study of sort of random interventions in the religiosity of education. But what we can see suggests that it's not educational attainment that secularizes kids. Getting a high school diploma doesn't make you less religious. It's the religiosity of social life, especially school. So doing 4 more years of education in a madrasa or in a Catholic high school is not going to make you less religious. But doing 4 more years of education at an explicitly secular institution where religious expression is prohibited and your role models present themselves in a non-religious way, even if they may personally be religious, that may be influential on students. And of course, we can see that American kids have had increasingly secular environments for education over the course of the last century and a half. So this is simply the average days attending public schools among all US minors in a given year. And of course, public schools have also become more secular over time with increasing restrictions on various forms of religiosity in school. So, and finally, another important topic is 2 religiously supportive parents. I don't have a graph here, but quite simply, having 2 parents of the same religion strongly predicts children remaining in that religion versus having religiously mixed households. Over time, religiously mixed households have become much more common. So these are factors that seem to matter a lot for these cohort level changes in religiosity that determine what happens to those children as they grow up and that determine the environment they grow up in. But there's something else too. Religious communities are shrinking in total. It's not just that religious people are a smaller share of the population. The absolute number of people with any meaningful attachment to religion is actually declining. This is pretty striking. The pace of decline is pretty similar to what we would see in like the average Eastern European country with low fertility and high outmigration. So this is sort of a demographic disaster situation. So why is that happening? Is it because so many people are converting away from religion into non-religious life philosophies or approaches? I don't think so. If you look at the share of people in various religious traditions who are converts, that is, they were not raised in that religious tradition, you can see that while nuns are very likely to be converts, that's this gray line, the share of nuns who are converts from some other religion is similar to what it was in the past. If anything, it's lower than it was in the past. That is, there's not evidence of some gangbuster growth in sort of conversion into nun status. In fact, if I break this down by growth in nuns by nuns who are raised as no religion versus those who converted, they're essentially identical trends. That is, growth in non-religious people is as much or more driven by people who grew up non-religious as it is by people who became non-religious after growing up in a religion. Right? So I don't think that this is about a wave of conversion. It's about babies. So if you think about what this is really showing, the share of people who are converts is just the residual of fertility. That is, the opposite of this is the share of people who are born into this faith. And what we can see is that for virtually all religious groups, that's except these other groups, which are small and largely new religious movements, but for Jews, Protestants, and Catholics, the three biggest religious groups, fertility is the overwhelming source of growth. And this isn't because children are going to get brainwashed into this, right? I already showed that that in fact, once people are mature adults, they don't tend to become more secular. So this is not a brainwashing thing. It's not like we keep them as long as we can, but over time we gradually lose people as they discover reason. That's not what happens. Rather, what happens is just that a share of people born into any tradition are going to leave it. And if the number of people born into that tradition is smaller, then the aggregate growth is going to be lower too. So we can actually look at this and we can quantify over the last 40 years using retrospective religious conversion data, how high would birth rates for a given religious tradition have needed to be in order to achieve growth? And then we can compare that to how high were birth rates in that group. So for example, non-religious groups will continue to grow in America if they have just 1.6 children on average per woman, because conversion rates into that group are relatively high. On the other hand, Catholic and Orthodox communities need to have 3 children on average just to avoid decline. This is not accounting for immigration, by the way. So immigration, of course, messes all these numbers up. So this is just accounting for patterns of conversion and fertility. Of course, the main reason Catholicism has not declined is because of immigration. Of course, over here we have the Amish. The Amish also need to have a fairly large amount of children in order to avoid decline, but of course the Amish have a very large amount of children. We can see that evangelical Protestants, they don't need to have that many kids. They really only need to have about 2 children to grow, whereas mainline Protestants need to have about 2.5. Historically, Black churches need to have about 2.4. Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses need to have about 2.1, 2.2. But of course, they do have about 3. So what we can see is that a lot of these groups are simply not having enough children. And I don't mean enough in some prescriptive sense. I mean, if they want to maintain the number of church buildings and seminaries and publishing houses that they will have to have more children, assuming conversion rates remain relatively stable. And the driver of this is that fertility has declined everywhere. So this is mortality adjusted fertility in the United States back to the 1840s. That is, I take the number of children and then I remove the share of those children who likely died before age 10. So this is showing us something like the number of children who actually survived to the age where they might show up in data about religion. And what we can see is that fertility today is quite low and declining. This means that population generally is going to grow slower. And as population growth slows down and the share religious declines, the total religious population will fall. So historically normal conversion patterns, we're not seeing extremely unusual conversion rates. Plus lower overall fertility is going to lead to declining absolute and relative religious populations, especially since religious groups have always been more fertility dependent for growth than like some of the more minor or fringe sects, as well as non-religious groups. And if we have declining religious populations, that means it's harder to find a same religion spouse. It's harder to financially support a denominational school. It's harder to achieve that scale. That means that religion is likely to be lower prestige. There will be fewer role models for children growing up in that religion, depending on what their career path is. Ultimately, what we see is as the absolute size of a religious community shrinks, the household environment for transmission becomes more difficult, which means the only small religions that survive are those with very aggressive norms for household transmission. That is, with very strong practices of household religious faith. So what does this mean for the future? Well, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow your church may look like this. This could be the future. This is what many people think the future will be. Some people are cheerleading this future. Obviously, I'm speaking as if the decline in religion is perhaps not a great thing. That could be debated. Welcome questions about that. But this is a fear that many millions of Americans have, and that they respond to in a very real and political way. Unless, in the words of the Lorax, if this is about household dynamics, if this is about families, if this is about babies, as I'm arguing it is, could society support parents more? Could we do something to change this? And could we do something that would be justifiable in a pluralist and liberal society? That is, we're not just going to like force people to pray in public schools or something. And I've got 4 easy ideas. 1, child allowances to encourage people to have more children. That is specifically to have children they want to have. We're not going to steal people's birth control. We're just going to let them have money to support their own choices. We can end marriage penalties, right? Right now we have massive marriage penalties baked into the welfare code, particularly for working class households. School choice. A key driver here is that parents cannot afford to find schools that support their values and their choices for their children. We should reinforce parental choice. If we're really a pluralist society, we should support the diverse choices that families want to make for their children. And finally, easier zoning. Housing is a major cost of childbearing. Also, churches are zoned out of many areas, which makes it actually difficult to operate a church in many communities. So these 4 things, easily justifiable in a pluralist society, have a significant impact on family and are likely to have a significant impact on the scale and position of religious communities in the long run. So if the problem is low birth rates, overstretched parents, and the lack of supportive education, there are solutions. At least I think so. What is not a solution is arguing about this. So with that, I will, if you don't get the joke there, that's fine. But that's my presentation to kind of start this discussion. But we have 2 people who I'm really interested to hear feedback from. I'm going to stop sharing here so that you can see all of our lovely faces. We do have, just to start this off, we got a question in advance. So I think actually we kind of have an expert on this question here. So the question is, one of the largest recent trends is, of course, the rise of the nuns, with the growth of religiously unaffiliated in recent decades. Is this a permanent trend, or is it part of a cyclical pattern that may reverse at some point in the future? So this is a nice springboard question. It relates exactly to this question of historic trends and what they mean for the future. And also, it happens to be, I believe, Daniel's dissertation topic. I'm going to just go ahead and open up the discussion with that prompt. Maybe, Daniel, I'll invite you to kind of comment on what I've said or respond to that question first. And then Ross, you can chime in on that as you see fit.
Great. Well, Lyman, thanks. And thanks for this great piece of scholarship. It is hefty at 40 pages, but well worth the read. I encourage everyone to look at it. And Lyman really brings some great new data. A lot of us who study this, have been very familiar with the General Social Survey, with Pew surveys. And Lyman brings a lot of new data, which is a very arduous task as someone who's done some of that work. So absolutely encourage everyone to take a look at it. And it addresses some, I think, really key issues. And when we look at, we think about this rise of people who are religiously unaffiliated, the NONES, and my dissertation was titled, "And Then There Were Nuns," which primarily looked at the millennial generation, but was sort of broadened in its scope after. And one of the things that I think is key that Lyman mentions is this sort of significant shift in family life and family structure. We're seeing a rise in blended families, a rise in divorces that peaked around 1980, right as the millennial generation, first part of the millennial generation was being born. And Lyman also mentioned this, the rise of religious diversity among couples. So we're seeing a rise of all these three things, all of which push people away from religion. And the other part I think that's incredibly important is we're seeing huge differences across generations that we didn't see previously. So in some of the survey work that I've done recently, we looked at just regular types of religious engagement in households growing up, whether it's attendance, whether it's prayer, saying grace at the dinner table. And across all these measures, millennials actually report having lower formative religious experiences than baby boomers and the silent generation, which is the generation that preceded them. And so they have less robust religious experiences, and that is the single biggest predictor of adult religious identity and behavior, what happens in childhood. And again, my work comports with what Lyman finds too, is that we're seeing people drift away, and it is a drift. It isn't, when we ask people why people are leaving, most people can't pinpoint a particular decision or moment that precipitated their departure. It was more like I sort of lost interest or just sort of, I drifted away. And we're seeing now among young people, it happens before the age of 18. So before they step foot on a college campus or move out of their parents' home, we're seeing people leave. And that suggests to me that we've got to really pay attention to what's happening among American families and American households to really understand what's going on. So I'll pause there. Plenty more to say. This is a super interesting topic, but I'll let others sort of jump in as well.
So I guess I'll jump in and I'll echo Daniel in thanking Lyman for this terrific and intensely interesting piece of work. And Lyman very modestly did not get into his intense methodological debates with other scholars of religion in his presentation here. But for viewers or listeners who are really into arguments about longitudinal trends in church affiliation, there's about 10 pages of just great stuff in there, and I hope you'll all dive in. I want to pick up on the nuns question briefly off sort of where Lyman finished up, but then also maybe pitch a question back at both of my co-panelists. I think on the question of nuns, part of what is striking about Lyman's focus on sort of insufficient fertility among religious households, basically, is that it runs sort of counter to a pretty common narrative in the field of religious punditry and prognostication, which is the idea that over time, differential fertility between the religious and the non-religious will inexorably lead to a comeback of conservative or traditional religion, right? And this is something that's sometimes argued in triumphalist tones by religious conservatives, and sometimes it's argued in more ambiguous terms, books with titles like "Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth?" But either way, it's a pretty common narrative. And I think there's actually a way to harmonize these narratives, right? You could say that it is both true in the short run that the existing religious population is not having enough kids to sustain itself absent some change in conversion rates, but also that maybe within religious communities, the most zealous and devout are having more children, and this will sort of move religious communities in a more traditionalist or orthodox direction. I think a lot of people have argued that's basically what's happening in American Judaism, right? That you have a combination of sort of overall decline because of intermarriage and lower birth rates joined to a steady increase in the Orthodox Jewish population. So that would be a harmonization, but I just think it's an interesting place where What Lyman is arguing is very much not sort of the conventional narrative, and maybe I'm curious if my co-panelists agree. The larger point that I would sort of raise is, in your data, Lyman, it seems like, somewhere between 1945 and 1965 is some kind of clear inflection point, right? You have a very long-term growth in American religious affiliation and practice that coincides with long-term growth rates in the American population. And at a certain point, as US population stagnation and maybe ultimately decline sets in, religion declines as well. And that means that it makes sense, I think, to have this focus on household formation, household stability, and so on. But you also spend a certain amount of time talking about, the role of education, the role of public education, the fact that more and more Americans are educated in public schools and secular schools. And there is a big, there's a big shift in that same window in the, from the 40s through the 60s in the sense that public schools are legally secularized by the Supreme Court, right? By sort of judicial force, and the sort of soft Protestantism of the sort of soft Protestant establishment that existed in public institutions in the US goes away. And so I think someone could look at the data that you've marshaled and say, yes, it absolutely makes a case that people interested in a recovery or a revival of religion in the US should be focused on these issues of family and family policy. But it also still leaves a lot of room for a kind of, in certain ways, the original culture war debate, right? Like the modern culture war sort of starts with the school prayer debates, which then sort of diminish as other issues come along. But I think you could take the data and say, look, there was a kind of elite revolution in American life that helps explain why 13-year-olds lose their faith, because they're sort of sent out from the home into a milieu that's more secularized than it was 60 or 70 years ago. And if that's the case, then maybe a religious recovery would also depend on a kind of recovery of religious influence among the people responsible for running the American educational system. So I'm curious what both of you, but maybe especially Lyman, think of that idea or argument.
Yeah. So the question of school prayer is kind of a big one, because it seems so closely related to what I'm talking about, right? With the increasing secularization of the school environment. And it's such a hot button issue. And as you said, it's kind of like that and Scopes Monkey are like the original culture war issues, right? So, so then the question is, if we reinstituted school prayer, will that make people more religious? And my argument is actually no. That is, there's sort of a kind of cat out of the bag issue here. It's possible that removing school prayer from American schools at a time when it was broadly popular accelerated secularization. That is, there's no evidence in the 1940s and 50s and 60s that Americans were like widely opposed to school prayer. And certainly there's no evidence that very many Americans were particularly secular at that time. This was the high watermark of American religiosity by virtually every measure. So it's possible that the intentional secularization of schools had a role to play in sort of nudging along the path of secularization as we've seen it. But there's a whole other section of the report, which in the interest of time, I didn't get into here, about blowback. What happens when you try to force people into religion? And I look at the case of established religions in US, in the 13 colonies. And I also look at Blaine amendments, anti-Sharia laws, and a few other cases where we really have cases of trying to use the state to tell people what their religion should be. And my read of it is that it doesn't work. In fact, it has a really nasty blowback effect that it in fact accelerates secularization. That when people feel like you're trying to tell them how they should worship, they don't like it. So forcing the child of atheist parents to pray in school is not going to make that child religious. However, giving a Catholic family the option to put their 3 kids in a Catholic school may considerably reduce the odds that, or may increase the odds that all 3 of those children remain in the church later on in life rather than just 1 or 2 of them. So I don't think that the state is an effective tool for evangelism. The IRS is not very winsome, but at the same time, the state is a very effective tool for breaking up the chain of transmission from parents to children, for basically tearing children out of their parents' sphere of influence. So I guess I would say that sort of it's possible that introducing or removing school prayer had an effect when it was implemented. It's unlikely that reintroducing it is going to have much effect, simply because the people that you'd be reintroducing it to, a large share of them, at this point, something like 20 or 30% of kids in the school system are going to experience this as coercion.
So one thing I would just jump in here, and I think you both alluded to this, but I think it's worth mentioning directly, is that the social context of young adults today is also just dramatically different than their parents' and grandparents' generation. And I think social influence plays an incredibly important role when we think about whether people engage religiously or if they've left, whether they come back. And so when Russell has questioned about whether people will return and whether we'll see an uptick in religious engagement, which I happen to be pretty bearish on, you really have to look at the social environment. And 40% of young people under the age of 30 are unaffiliated, which makes it sort of the most common religious identity if you compare it to major religious traditions. Young people are actually more likely to know an atheist than an evangelical Christian, which when you tell a room full of people older than 50, they gasp, but when you tell people a room full of people under 30, they're like, yeah, of course. And so the social environment is incredibly important. And also it leads to the kind of friendships people develop, and actually in spousal selection as well. So if you look a generation ago, if you look in a general social survey in the 70s, young people who are unaffiliated who got married people who were religious. And then, most of whom eventually became religious, they raised their children religious. If you look at today, most unaffiliated people who get marry someone who's also unaffiliated. So we're seeing this rise of secular couples, which I also then think marriage may not actually be the key in increasing religiosity. So it's not just the decline of marriage, but we're seeing homogeneity within marriage among secular folks, which we didn't used to see, which is, again, a really new development. And I think it's going to be more difficult than sort of saying, marriage can help us solve this challenge. Well, married people are more religious, but that's because they're more married religious couples. But as we see this sort of spike in secular married couples, I think it complicates the story a little bit.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. Particularly when I think about the social context. I mean, I think about the school prayer issue a lot because it is so hot button. And the fact that, as you said, young people are more likely to know and to have a friend who's a relatively committed atheist than they are to have a friend who's a relatively committed evangelical Christian, means that the perception of, frankly, the perception of persecution is quite different. That is something that you do that discriminates against evangelical Christians simply will not cause as many young people to be aware of a martyr as something that you do that discriminates against an atheist student. That is, people are often motivated by observing the suffering of other people. That is, we hate to see injustice done to those that we like. This is sort of the political argument about the speedy social acceptance of homosexuality related to, sort of publicly coming out of the closet and talking about these things and talking about discrimination as well, is that the awareness of how this given policy impacts your friends and your family changes how you feel about it. So my worry with, aside from the fact that I'm just sort of a civil libertarian, on a lot of these issues. My worry with things like school prayer is that the number of people who will feel discriminated against by it is quite considerable, and I think they actually have a legitimate claim they can make. So I strongly prefer just saying, look, we're not going to force anyone. We're just going to give parents choices. You don't have to. Yeah.
But there is variation, right? I mean, we're making generalizations. There are obviously parts of the United States where people are much more likely to know an evangelical Christian than they are to know an atheist. Not so much in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. or in the suburbs of New York. But if you go to like the suburbs of Knoxville, Tennessee, people are more likely to know an evangelical Christian than an atheist. And one of the arguments would be the sort of pro school prayer or case, if would be that the transmission belt that you're describing, Lyman, still exists in parts of the country to a much stronger degree than it exists in others. And if the Supreme Court allowed more school prayer, the suburbs of Boston are not going to suddenly institute the Our Father at the end, right? No matter what, a few integralists at Ivy League institutions want. That's not likely to happen. But the suburbs of Jackson, Mississippi might. And then you do have the question of, well, there are more atheists even in the suburbs of Jackson, and maybe the sort of the feeling of marginalization that an atheist student feels and the sympathy that engenders is more significant. But there would be communities in the US where having public schools display religiosity, or at least permit a little more religiosity, could sustain a transmission belt. And it wouldn't be just a case of sort of, the Federalist, the religious wing of the Federalist Society sort of trying to impose Christianity. But I obviously take your points. I mean, to go back to the fertility issue for a minute, my question for both of you is, right now there is some fertility gap between the religious and non-religious, and based on Lyman's data, it seems that fertility gap for now is being outweighed by the attrition rate. Right. So even though if the religious are having more kids, the attrition rate means that their communities are still shrinking. Can either of you guys see a future? I mean, the latest news just today is that US fertility just hit a new low. Lyman's done a lot of work suggesting we won't get a coronavirus baby boom, which, as someone home with now 4 children right now, I'm not surprised by that finding. Is there a point at which some sort of secular versus religious fertility gap gets wide enough to outweigh the attrition problem that Lyman is describing, do you think?
So so religious fertility differentials have been pretty stable for the last 30, 40, 50 years. It depends a bit on how you measure it. If you use just sort of affiliation, it's not as big of a, there is some sense of convergence of that. But if you look at belonging in a more significant way, like attendance or membership, then the religious fertility differential is pretty stable. And this holds up across internationally as well, in Europe and things like that. And it appears to reach back I'm not sure if I cite them, but I'm aware of studies reaching back as far back as the 1840s in the U.S., where they identified counties with more biblical names, and those counties had higher fertility. There was a study that looked at data from the 1850 and 1860 U.S. censuses of religious bodies and found that counties with more Lutherans had a lot higher birth rates. So Lutherans. I'm happy about that one. So, the religious fertility differential is quite durable. It's quite resilient. However, the oldest survey data we have that can get at religious affiliation, so nuns, reaches back to about 1910. And already in 1910, we were seeing a declining trend in religiosity. Now, it's slow. There is an inflection point in like the 50s and 60s. But peak affiliation in America was the earliest data we have. and for all we know, maybe it was declining earlier than that. Which to me suggests the fertility differential has been there a long time. And yet the rise of the nuns has been going on a long time. I showed that other chart that the share of nuns who are converts in hasn't radically changed over time. So I think that conversion into nuns, in ES, not in UNS, is probably a fairly durable feature of most modern societies as they exist today. Now, there are places in Eastern Europe right now experimenting with a very different kind of social contract. It'll be interesting to see what happens to religiosity in Poland, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, as they really intervene in family and fertility policy in a pretty unique way. But I'm very skeptical of the idea that the fertility differential is going to grow, is going to be sufficiently large, and the conversion differential sufficiently small that the trends of the last century, it is really the last century, are going to be overturned, barring a significant policy change or a significant change in household behaviors by religious people. And actually what Daniel mentioned about more homogenous secular couples really plays into this. You could see the non-religious birth rate begin to rise as the non-religious population begins to select more, let's say, ideologically normal people. That is, it's not just like the fringe 1% of atheists like it was in 1940 or whatever, but it's a large share of people who have statistically normal family desires, but just happen to not be religious.
The other thing I'll just add to the mix here too is I think you can't really divorce fertility from retention rates and attrition, right? So among the unaffiliated, I think Pew had a study a few years ago, and then we did it and looked at retention rates among different religious groups. And I think in 2007, the first time it was done, the unaffiliated had the lowest retention rate. They could not keep, so people raised in unaffiliated households, by and large, became religious as adults at some point over their life course. But what we see now is that actually unaffiliated folks have about the same retention rates as Catholics. So I think it's around 60%. So 60% of Catholics and unaffiliated folks raised in those households remain so as adults. And that's really new, that the unaffiliated folks have it really significantly increased their levels of retention, without which, I mean, the fertility almost, is not really that consequential. If you can't keep your members, it doesn't really matter how many you're having.
So this is a great conversation, but I do want to get to a couple of the questions that I'm getting in my chat box here from viewers. So we got one here saying, asking about this backlash idea, and specifically, why doesn't increased secularization preventing parents and communities from having, for example, prayer in school, not provoke more religiosity in response? That is, why don't religious people sort of have this get angry response that I'm suggesting secular people do? Yeah. So why don't we see that if sort of heavy-handed religious interventions cause secularization, why don't we see religiosity arising in response to secular policy and positions? I'll make a very brief response to that, and then I invite your all's comments as well. My first reason would be simply that we actually haven't had heavy-handed secular policy impositions until very recently. That is, banning school prayer did not force students to like stand up and say, I confess that there is no God, right? In societies that do have that kind of explicit persecution, I mean, the mantra is the blood of the martyrs is the spring rain of the church, right? This is like a phrase that Christians toss around a lot, that persecution creates a kind of devoutness. Mormons would simply argue in favor of that. Jehovah's Witnesses would as well. There's a long-standing hypothesis of this. Now, data on it isn't extremely strong, but But I would argue that simply until quite recently, the evidence that Christians were facing net discriminatory conditions was quite thin on the ground. Now, in the last 10 years or so, there has been an uptick, as I document in the paper, in hate crimes against Christians. And we do see some evidence of this. Another group that has experienced a lot of discrimination and it's arguably increased religiosity is African Americans. And a lot of that discrimination was aimed at churches. Church burnings are an iconic form of racist violence. And there's an argument that this actually motivated religious commitment as a form of solidarity. So I'd argue part of what's going on is just you ain't seen nothing yet in terms of how bad it can get for sort of mainstream Christianity. If it does get really bad, you might see sort of a hardcore response, but we're nowhere close. I mean, I live in China. The US is nowhere close to that yet. So, but I invite other thoughts on that from you all.
I mean, Lyman, yeah, I think you make this point in the paper, but just in, the history of the West, of the recent history of the Western world, you have plenty of examples of religious resilience being stronger in contexts of pressure and persecution. So the most Catholic countries in Europe are arguably, at least 20 years ago, were Poland and Ireland, which had a long history of Catholic identity being under pressure. And I think even in the United States, you can tell a pretty compelling story of, my own Catholic faith's history as one of strength and resilience under pressure and dissolution upon sort of assimilation, right? That the church is stronger during the era of the Blaine Amendments in certain ways than it is in the, once John F. Kennedy gets elected president. So that's certainly true, or certainly plausible. At the same time, there also clearly was religious backlash against the school prayer decisions. There was, you can take cases like creches being removed from city squares and so on. I mean, a lot of what we thought of as sort of the rise of religious conservatism was itself motivated by feelings of secular imposition. And it's just interesting, like sort of, everything is a snapshot in time, right? Like I started out as a journalist in the early 2000s. And at that moment, the rise of the nuns had happened to some extent, but not at the accelerated pace of the early 21st century. And there was a certain amount of data that made people say, well, we'd had this wave of secularization in the 60s and 70s, but now, in part, precisely as a kind of reaction against it, you've had a kind of evangelical revival. And that narrative doesn't seem to hold at the moment, but it was what most people, or many people, believed 20 years ago. So I don't think you can say for certain what the landscape will look like 20 years from now.
Yeah, I'll just mention one. So if folks are familiar with Robert Putnam's work, American Grace, he engages this a little bit, looking at sort of shocks and aftershocks. And I think it's a great treatment for folks who want to sort of dig in a little deeper.
Okay, we have another question that was sent in advance, and I think it actually dovetails really nicely with what you were saying, Ross. The question is, 80% of evangelicals voted for and continue to support Trump. I've read reports that younger evangelicals find this hypocritical and may be withdrawing from their churches. Will this affect support by evangelicals for their conservative political and social beliefs? So there's actually several questions in there all at once. But it's basically asking about, is support of Trump going to cost evangelicals? What's going on there? And I think that's a great question for you to make a first response to, Ross.
Why me? I don't represent evangelicalism. I mean, I think I find that narrative very plausible, but precisely because I find it very plausible, I try to also maintain some skepticism about it. I think those of us who, one, sort of operate in elite circles where people tend to be, as you may have noticed, very hostile to Donald Trump, and two, spend a lot of time thinking about politics tend to find it very easy to believe that there's going to be this sort of large scale, internal backlash followed by exodus driven by, the hypocrisy involved in being an intense Christian supporter of Donald Trump. But it could, and I do sort of think that, as unprovable as this is, that the sense that sort of the George W. Bush presidency, which sort of embodied the evangelical Catholic alliance and sort of the temporary ascent of religious conservatism, the fact that that was seen to sort of end in failure on so many fronts, I sort of think that did play a very mild role in disaffiliation and secularization. But that's not provable, and as far as I can tell, in any regression analysis. And I think it could just be that, to take the data that Lyman has, like people's religious choices are formed by their families and their institutions much more than even now by their Twitter feeds or by sort of, by sort of external political narratives. And it could be that in 10 years we'll look back and we'll say, yeah, there were a lot of individual younger evangelicals who really didn't like Donald Trump and had big fights with their parents about it. But we don't see in the data some like great falling away where, where the younger generation was so alienated by Trumpism that they left their churches. But what do you guys think?
I mean, I think ironically, it's not the conservative Christians or young evangelicals who are drifting away. It's the moderate and liberal religious folks who have, over the last, I think, couple decades, disaffiliated at much higher rates, I think, because of the association of, traditional religiosity and Republican politics or conservative politics. And I wrote about that relatively recently. There's been this discussion about the rise of a reinvigorated religious left. And back in 2017, I wrote that this is not really that likely because you see this dramatic acceleration of secularity among liberals, particularly among young liberals, who I think about 50% of whom are now secular. So I think what we've seen, and there's a lot of academic literature and sociology on this, is that this sort of marriage or alliance of conservative Christian theology and politics, and particularly I think the sort of strong identity, that sort of conservative Christians sort of say this is what Christianity actually is, and making those kind of claims, I think has led to folks who are more moderate or liberals who are saying, well, maybe if this is what Christianity is, then I'm not Christian. And you actually see this. There's data that shows that among liberal parents across generations, we're seeing declines. So liberal parents of the baby boomer generation and silent generation were about as likely as conservative parents to raise their kids religiously. But if you look at Xers and now millennial liberals, they're far less likely than their conservative counterparts to raise their kids religious.
Okay, that is, I don't think we have time for another question. We are about out of time here. So I want to thank both of you for this conversation. It was definitely very beneficial to me. I hope it was to you as well.
That's what we're here for you, Lyman. That's what we're here for.
we can do like 8 more of these. We've done like maybe 10% of the report at this point.
Right. We've covered like 3 of the graphs. So, but if it weren't for COVID, we could just take it on the road. But we'd have to be quarantined in each state. But I appreciate your all's time. I appreciate everyone who signed on to listen and watch. You can access the report at AEI's website. Of course, there you can also see a lot of Daniel's really interesting work and some of the surveys that he's run with AEI. And of course, Ross has his book out, which I have not read yet, but it's on the to read list.
Lyman, what?
The mail is running very slow to Hong Kong these days. So
Kindle, man, you can, It's...
So thank you all so much. And also this will be posted as a recording, I believe, the next day or two. So if you want to share and send to others so they can all benefit from our wisdom, go right ahead. Thanks very much.